On February 28, 2018, an Airbus A320 encountered a cascade of critical failures while on a training exercise in Tallinn, Estonia. The flight controls had stopped working, the flaps were stuck, and the right-hand engine had caught fire. The cockpit was filled with a terrifying array of bells and alarms as the pilots tried desperately to bring the plane back for an emergency landing. How had this routine training exercise gone so terribly wrong, and how would the flight crew get out of this life-and-death situation? This is, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating and unlikely stories in the history of aviation. This is the story of SmartLynx Estonia Flight 9001. On February 28, 2018, 7 people boarded an Airbus A320 operating as SmartLynx Estonia Flight 9001. Among them were 4 trainee pilots, an instructor, a safety pilot, and an inspector from the Estonian Civil Aviation Authority. The purpose of this flight was for the 4 trainee pilots to practice flying the aircraft as part of the airline's A320 training program. The plan was for the trainees to spend about 5 hours performing takeoffs, go-rounds, and touch-and-go landings, all under the supervision of the instructor. The safety pilot would be watching over the operation, ready to step in an emergency, while the inspector from the Estonian Civil Aviation Authority would be there to monitor the airline's training program. For the trainees, this was to be an exciting, albeit demanding experience. This would be the first time they would be flying the A320 in real life, having spent months learning how to do it in the simulator. They had no idea as they took to the skies on this day that performing well in front of their instructor would end up being the least of their concerns. In a matter of hours, all 7 men on board would be face to face with their own mortality, as their aircraft careened out of control in the skies above Estonia. The kinds of failures they would experience on this day, and the exact sequence of events which led to it, had never occurred before on a commercial aircraft. For the first few hours, everything went to plan. Everything except one small detail, which we'll return to in a moment. One by one, the trainee pilots took their turns sitting in the right-hand seat, attempting their first takeoffs, landings, and go-rounds in the real aircraft. Their instructor, a 63-year-old aviation veteran with just over 24,000 hours of flying experience under his belt, sat in the left-hand seat. He watched over the trainees closely as they completed their exercises, providing guidance where needed. Sitting in the 2 jump seats behind the trainee and the instructor were the safety pilot and an inspector. As the first 3 trainees carried out their touch and goes, there was one caution message which kept appearing on the ECAM, or Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor. This is the center display in the cockpit which, among other things, provides pilots with information on any faults the aircraft is detecting. This particular message appeared about a minute after every touch and go, and it read ELAC 1 pitch fault. The pilots knew this meant that there was something wrong with one of the plane's computers, but when they consulted the manual, it recommended that they simply turn the computer off and then back on again. They did this, and each time the message disappeared, only to reappear after the next landing. This looked to be a minor warning on the surface, but in truth, it was only the tip of the iceberg. Things were about to go seriously wrong on this flight. When it came time for the 4th trainee to do his 3rd touch and go, the pilots had forgotten to reset the computer. This should not have been a problem. Even though this computer had failed, there are 3 more computers ready to take over. In aviation, safety is achieved through an extraordinary level of redundancy. However, as the plane came in to land this time, something unprecedented happened. The plane touched down on the runway as normal, and bounced a little, but when the trainee pilot went to pull the side stick to bring the aircraft back into the sky, nothing happened.
Rotate, rotate. I am rotating.
The instructor took over and pulled back on his side stick, but the plane didn't respond to him either. It was as if both side sticks had been disconnected from the flight controls. They were now as useless as toy controllers. The aircraft then entered a slow climb by itself, and the instructor decided to abort the takeoff, reducing the engine power to idle for 4 seconds. However, he quickly realised that there wasn't enough room left on the runway to stop, so he then pushed the thrust levers to their maximum setting. In an effort to bring the aircraft back into the air, he pulled back on the side stick and raised the wheels and the flaps. But the side stick had been rendered utterly useless, so the plane never climbed. In fact, as the flaps started to retract, the plane lost lift and began sinking towards the ground. The plane then slammed onto the runway shortly before the end, its engines taking the brunt of the impact. The engines were critically damaged by this impact, yet they continued producing power. Within moments, the aircraft had gained enough speed that it started to climb. But this was no ordinary climb. As the pilots had no ability to control the plane, it simply did what was aerodynamically possible, which in this case was to zoom upwards at a rate of about 6,000 feet per minute. The instructor tried desperately to push the nose down. If the plane continued to climb like this, its speed would bleed off and it would stall and then tumble back to Earth. But his efforts were of no use. The side stick was simply not working. On top of this, a cacophony of alarms had now erupted in the cockpit. Most seriously, they warned the pilots that the right-hand engine was on fire. This was now truly a life or death situation, and it was one that the pilots had never trained for. The 7 men on board had now become passengers in their own aircraft as it careened skywards. Suddenly, the safety pilot sitting in the jump seat behind the trainee shouted,
"Manual pitch trim only, manual pitch trim only."
He had spotted the warning message on the primary flight display, and straight away realised that there was one last way by which the pilots could control their aircraft. The manual pitch trim wheel, located here, can be moved by hand to control the horizontal stabiliser in the tail of the aircraft. It offers a far less accurate way of controlling the vertical pitch of the aircraft than the side stick, but it was their only hope. The instructor quickly grabbed the manual trim wheel and started pushing it forwards to point the nose of the aircraft down, but he went too far. Everybody on board was lifted out of their seats as the plane began diving towards the ground, reaching a terrifying vertical speed of over 7,000 feet per minute. The ground proximity warning alarm now sounded in the cockpit alongside the other alarms as the plane rapidly approached the earth below. The instructor shoved the thrust levers to the maximum setting and aggressively cranked the trim wheel in the opposite direction in a desperate attempt to pull the plane out of its terrifying plunge. Finally, at just 600 feet above the ground, the plane pulled out of its dive. The manoeuvre was so extreme that it pushed the pilots hard into their seats with a force of 2.4 Gs. The plane then swooped up into another out-of-control climb. This was a roller coaster ride from hell, but the instructor was learning fast. He pushed the trim wheel forward, reduced the engine thrust, and rolled the plane to one side, allowing the aircraft to slide sideways into a more manageable position. Finally, he had a chance to assess the situation more systematically. With all of the alarms going off, he asked,
"Do we have engines?"
To which the safety pilot replied,
"We have engine 2 fire."
Even without this, the crew's situation was dire. The instructor declared a mayday, but forgot to key his microphone to broadcast this to air traffic control. He continued trying to keep the plane under control, but the trim wheel was just too coarse an instrument for him to do this effectively. The aircraft had entered a cycle. It would start pitching up, then lose speed as it climbed, then it would pitch down and gain speed, which in turn would cause it to pitch up, and so on ad infinitum. This is known as phugoid motion. The instructor couldn't prevent this movement. All he could do was try to dampen it as best he could, by using a combination of engine thrust, the trim wheel, and by rolling the aircraft. This was a critical situation, and with the damaged engines, time was running out. As the instructor tried to dampen these movements, the safety pilot sitting behind him started listing off the warning messages on the ECAM.
So we have flaps lock, flight control law, left-right elevator fault, maximum speed 320, manual pitch trim use, do not use speed brakes.
The trainee pilot, sitting in the right-hand seat, was completely overwhelmed. The crew's high-tech aircraft was now a flaming piece of wreckage. The landing gear had been damaged from its impact with the runway while semi-extended. In fact, some of the landing gear doors had been bent by the impact and then torn off by the force of the air as the plane flew. With every passing second, the engines deteriorated further. There would not be enough time for the pilots to troubleshoot the various problems in the air. In a matter of minutes, their engines would fail, and any chance of a safe landing will have vanished. All the 3 trainee pilots sitting in the front passenger rows could do was pray for the best as their instructor fought with a situation more grave than he had ever encountered in his decades of flying. The instructor decided to turn back towards the runway. He confirmed with the safety pilot that a right turn would work, and then he began banking the aircraft to the right. With no elevators to counter the downward pitching movement that turning induced, the instructor had to be extremely careful as he made this 180-degree turn. Meanwhile, the safety pilot declared an emergency to air traffic control.
"Mayday, mayday, mayday, we have flight control fail."
The controller cleared them to make a right turn and approach the runway visually. The instructor then told the safety pilot and the trainee pilot to switch seats. The overwhelmed trainee pilot left the right-hand seat and headed back into the passenger cabin along with the inspector, while the safety pilot swung into action. The two most experienced pilots were now at the controls. Their fate, and that of everybody on board, rested on whether they could nurse their stricken aircraft back to the runway before its engines failed altogether. The instructor pressed the master caution button to silence the alarm at last.
What is the heading of the runway? 262. Tallinn Tower, we are going for runway 26.
There would not be enough time to bring the aircraft back around for an approach to the opposite direction runway, where the winds were more favourable. They had to attempt a landing as soon as possible, and that meant doing a 180-degree turn and landing on runway 26. As the instructor lined the crippled aircraft up with the runway, the safety pilot suggested moving the thrust lever for engine number 2 to idle, given that it was on fire. This was the standard procedure, but the instructor's experience allowed him to see that in this particular situation, even an engine which was on fire was better than one which was turned off entirely. He responded,
"If I'm losing an engine in manual flying, I prefer to land when engines are working."
Just over a minute from the runway, the safety pilot lowered the landing gear. Without fine directional control of the aircraft, the pilots were approaching the runway from a somewhat oblique angle. It would take every bit of concentration to get the aircraft onto the runway. The instructor began a slight left turn to line the aircraft up, but seconds later, the right-hand engine failed. The fire alarm began sounding in the cockpit, and the safety pilot announced,
"Engine 2 is shut down."
The instructor barely responded. His focus was entirely on the runway in front of him. He had one chance to land this aircraft. But with just one engine working, the plane began to lose speed. The instructor told the safety pilot to lower the flaps, in order to provide the aircraft with more lift as it slowed down. Then, less than a minute from the runway, the left engine failed as well. The 60-ton aircraft was now nothing more than a giant glider. The four people sitting in the front of the passenger cabin would have experienced a sickening sinking feeling as the engines quit and the plane began to drop. Without engines to supply electrical power, all of the cockpit instrumentation went dark. The remaining computers shut down, and now all the instructor had at his disposal were the manual stabilizer trim and the rudder. Within seconds, a small fan known as the ram air turbine popped out from the bottom of the fuselage. By spinning in the wind, it generated enough electricity to power some of the instruments, as well as some critical systems. But without engines, the plane was starting to slip below the glide slope. It was slowing down and getting close to an aerodynamic stall. The instructor tried desperately to keep the plane in the air, pitching the nose down to maintain speed, but not so much that he would crash into the forest in front of the runway. The safety pilot watched in horror as the airspeed dropped.
Speed 150. Speed 130. Speed 120.
The instructor had to strike a perfect balance. Go too slow, and the aircraft would fall out of the sky. Descend too fast, on the other hand, and the plane would crash into the forest short of the runway. The instructor pitched up, doing everything he could to stretch the glide, even if it meant risking a stall. The speed bled off all the way until the aircraft was travelling at 100 knots, just a few knots above stall speed. The aircraft smacked down into the snow 150 metres short of the runway threshold. All tyres burst on impact, and the plane slid onto the runway and gradually decelerated along its length. After a barely controllable slide, it skidded off the left-hand side of the runway. Finally, the aircraft came to a stop. The safety pilot and one of the trainee pilots had received minor injuries, including a concussion, but apart from that, everyone on board had escaped unscathed. When investigators from the Estonian Safety Investigation Bureau arrived on scene, they found a plane which was in tatters. Both engines had been damaged beyond repair from their collision with the runway. The fuselage was bent out of shape. There were punctures in the skin on the bottom of the aircraft, and some of the landing gear doors were missing. They were later found miles from the airport, having fallen off the aircraft in flight. As a result of this damage, the aircraft was written off. It was miraculous that the pilots had managed to bring it back to the runway, considering the state that it was in. But what had caused this catastrophic failure in the first place? How had the flight controls simply frozen? Investigators examined the aircraft's flight data recorders and discovered that the warning the pilots had received throughout the training session, ELAC-1 pitch fault, was actually just the tip of a large and insidious iceberg. The ELAC referred to in this message stands for Elevator Aileron Computers. The elevator is a control surface on the tailplane which points the aircraft up and down. ELAC-1 is one of two computers which control the elevator. The other one, naturally enough, is called ELAC-2. The warning the pilots were getting was that ELAC-1 had stopped working. That should have been no problem, because when ELAC-1 fails, ELAC-2 takes over. And in the unlikely event that ELAC-2 fails as well, there are two more computers standing by to take over, known as SEC-1 and SEC-2. It would take a whole separate video to do justice to the exact sequence of events which led to each of these computers shutting down on this day. However, the main culprit was traced back to the following. Normally, when the A320 touches down on the runway, the computers enter what is known as ground mode, which trims the horizontal stabilizer on the plane's tail such that the nose of the aircraft pitches down. This makes it easier for pilots to plant the aircraft on the runway and keep it there during landing. But on this training flight, the pilots weren't practicing full landings. They just needed to touch down on the runway and then get straight back into the air so that they could try again. For this reason, they wanted to avoid the automatic trimming of the horizontal stabilizer which pushed the nose down. To stop this from happening, the instructor held on to the manual trim wheel during each landing, which overrode the computer's command to pitch the nose down. This meant that the pilots could easily pull the aircraft back into the air once they had touched down. But here's where the trouble started. The computers are always comparing the actual stabilizer position with the stabilizer position which is commanded by the computers. If it detects a discrepancy between the actual position and the commanded position, it assumes that the computer has failed, and it triggers a fault warning. But you can't have a fault warning every time a pilot overrides a commanded position by using the manual trim wheel, so Airbus built in a switch, which detects if a pilot is using the trim wheel, and then allows there to be a discrepancy between the position commanded by the computer and the actual position of the horizontal stabilizer. However, on this particular aircraft, there was something wrong with this switch. Investigators found that the oil used to lubricate it was twice as viscous as it should have been. This abnormally high viscosity meant that each time the instructor held the manual trim wheel as the plane touched down, this switch never triggered, and the computer didn't know that he was doing this. As a result, it thought that there was a real discrepancy between the actual position of the stabilizer and the commanded position. As a result of this, it shut down the computer responsible for moving the stabilizer, ELAC-1, and handed over control to ELAC-2. This is why the pilots kept seeing the warning message ELAC-1 pitch fault every time they took off. And every time the pilots saw this message, they carried out the recommended action by turning the computer off and then on again. But on one approach, they didn't do this. When they came in for a touch and go on this approach, ELAC-1 was still off, and ELAC-2 was responsible for controlling the horizontal stabilizer trim. When the aircraft touched down this time, ELAC-2 then sensed the same discrepancy between the actual position and the commanded position, and it shut off, handing over control to the third computer in the list, SEC-1. SEC stands for Spoiler Elevator Computer. As the name suggests, it controls both the spoilers on the wings and the elevators on the tailplane. Part of the information fed into this computer is whether the aircraft is on the ground or in the air, so it can decide whether to automatically deploy the spoilers on landing to help slow the plane down. However, on this landing, the aircraft bounced, and for that brief second there was a mismatch between the two sensors, with one detecting the aircraft as being on the ground and the other detecting it as being in the air. This mismatch led to the shutdown of both SEC-1 and SEC-2, leaving the elevators locked in the neutral position. The pilot's side sticks were now utterly useless at controlling the vertical pitch of the aircraft. As a result of this near catastrophe, Airbus changed its procedures to instruct pilots not to reset the ELACs multiple times in flight. The current procedure is that if an ELAC fault warning comes up more than once, this is sufficient grounds for landing and getting the problem fixed. Airbus also corrected the software design flaw that led to the shutdown of the third and fourth computers, SEC-1 and SEC-2. For their part, SmartLynx Estonia mandated that instructors must stop training flights if there is an error message about the flight controls. The source of the thick oil responsible for the initial ELAC shutdown has never been determined. The truth is that these changes have probably not prevented any similar incidents, and probably never will. That's not because they were ineffective, but rather because the particular set of circumstances which caused these failures was incredibly unlikely. The fact that the instructor managed to land this plane after losing control of the elevators as both engines failed is nothing short of miraculous. At the end of the day, his skill and his teamwork with his colleague saved the lives of all on board. Had a less experienced crew been at the controls, the outcome would likely not have been so fortuitous.